If history is any guide, the most dangerous thing in war isn't a weapon, it's the soldier wielding it. War has always been shaped by technology, but its deadliest force has never been the sword, the gun, or the tank. It has always been the soldier. From knights in plate armor to riflemen in trenches, from paratroopers dropping behind enemy lines to special forces in cutting-edge combat gear, armies have adapted to new weapons and tactics. But what happens when technology takes the soldier beyond human limits? When power armor turns infantry into walking fortresses, when neural implants make reaction times faster than thought, and when entire battalions move with the coordination of a single, unstoppable force, marching in lockstep and coordinating with impossible precision. Today we'll explore the rise of the next generation of warriors, Stormtroopers forged not just by discipline and training, but by the cutting edge of science and engineering. Last month we explored Space Marines, focusing on ship-to-ship combat, boarding actions, and Warhammer 40,000's Adeptus Astartes. But there was too much to cover in one episode, so today we shift from genetically enhanced warriors of the far future to another iconic force from long ago in a galaxy far away, Star Wars Stormtroopers. Ironically, their first appearance in A New Hope is during a Marine-style ship-to-ship boarding action, but our focus today will be on their role in ground combat. The introduction remains one of the most memorable in cinematic history, showcasing the elite 501st Stormtrooper Legion, also known as Vader's Fist. I am a big Star Wars EU fan, or Legends, so appropriately, today marks the 501st weekly episode of Science and Futurism with Isaac Arthur. Here, we often gain insight in the future by analyzing science fiction, exploring its realism, or lack thereof, and considering what real science suggests instead. Serious topics and real science, but in a fun package. And if that sounds fun, make sure to hit the like and subscribe buttons and grab a drink and a snack as we storm into the topic of future warfare and elite infantry. The Star Wars Stormtroopers take their name from history, specifically the German Imperial Army Stormtruppen of World War I, rather than the more common assumption of a World War II reference. These were shock troops, sometimes called shove troops, trained to break through enemy lines in trench warfare, a theme closely tied to our discussion today. The fictional Stormtroopers are portrayed as elite, or so we are told. However, in the original trilogy, they seem to have notoriously bad aim and even lose to Ewoks. By contrast, the clone troopers of the prequel trilogy are shown to be far more capable, trained from birth and grown in batches as a mass-produced elite fighting force, and this is also of interest to us today, cloning or mass-producing troops. Why stop at one Jango Fett when you can have an army? Turns out even cloning has its limits. Cloning an elite soldier like Jango Fett, especially if his memories and training could be included, helps circumvent some of the usual quality versus quantity trade-offs. However, other challenges remain, so let's explore them. The balance of quality versus quantity in warfare is a fundamental tension that has shaped military strategy throughout history. Every army must decide how much to invest in elite soldiers, well-trained, highly equipped, and carefully selected troops, versus sheer numbers, relying on mass conscription and overwhelming force. How elite soldiers change the battlefield. Elite soldiers, whether modern special forces, historical knights, or the genetically engineered clone troopers of Star Wars, offer key advantages in battle. Their superior training, advanced equipment, and rigorous selection allow them to achieve objectives that would be impossible for a mass army. In tactical operations such as infiltration, sabotage, or special reconnaissance, a small number of elite troops can have an outsized impact, disrupting enemy supply lines, capturing high-value targets, or neutralizing strategic threats. In a high-tech future battlefield, elite soldiers might wield powered exosuits, cybernetic enhancements, genetic alterations or biotech, AI-assisted reactions or tactics, augmented reality heads-up displays, and weapons of incredible power, accuracy, or both, making them exponentially more effective than a typical infantry soldier. In space combat scenarios, as we discussed in Space Marines, highly trained shock troopers capable of boarding actions, ship security, and zero-gravity combat would make all the difference. The downside: elite troops are often expensive, rare, and slow to train. I had the honor to work with special forces several times in Iraq, and they always made me feel like an amateur. And while they're picky about their recruiting, a lot of it was simply training, years of it and at very high intensity, even compared to normal frontline combat units. So if they suffer heavy casualties, replacements may take years, even decades, to properly train and equip, especially if cloning or cybernetic augmentation is involved. Their effectiveness also hinges on mission parameters. While devastating in urban combat, special operations, and surgical strikes, they can be overwhelmed by sheer numbers in a prolonged attritional conflict. In the wider context of elite troops, there is also an opportunity cost in recruiting them. As an example, your ideal recruit for special forces also tends to overlap heavily with your ideal sergeants and line officers. In fiction contexts, those elite and clever spies and assassins we often see would also be excellent in positions of leadership even outside of military, security, and intelligence roles, even regular civilian roles in both public and private sector. When you start getting folks so apparently elite they are James Bond good at everything, or comic book hero awesome at everything like Tony Stark or Reed Richards, they really ought to be running your R&D, or even your country, while people using the tech they make should be handling the missions. Admittedly, this is coming from someone whose favorite comic book character is Dr. Doom. Why mass conscription armies often dominate. 10 elite warriors might crush 10 conscripts, but against 100, that's a different story. Historically, quantity has its own quality. This is doubly true in a lot of societies where the birth rates were high and the land was already quite settled and the economy was mostly subsistence farming. You end up with surplus people. Large-scale conscription forces have tended to win wars because they can absorb higher casualty rates, maintain operational tempo, and exert political and strategic pressure that elite troops alone cannot. It is also important to understand that a lot of the value of elite troops is that in battle against similarly sized forces, they would tend to have a dominating victory, take few losses, and can turn around and do that again, so that 10 elite troops might fight 10 conscripts and take no casualties, and be able to do that over and over again, but faced with 100 they might get mulched. We do have some surprisingly impressive examples of smaller elite forces beating bigger ones, some of which are historically dubious. We also have plenty of them getting ground under by sheer numbers. Historically, as wars grind on, you tend to get a lot of veteran conscripts trained by war, while attrition tends to get your elite troops too. This dynamic holds even in science fiction. In Star Wars, the Republic's clone troopers begin as a highly trained elite force, where the Empire later shifts to mass recruitment, sacrificing quality for sheer numbers. Details vary by which era of Star Wars canon we're using. Similarly, in Warhammer 40,000, the Emperor's Space Marines are formidable, but they are vastly outnumbered by the billion-strong Astra Militarum, whose overwhelming numbers grind down enemies in brutal wars of attrition. The logistics of war, the true force multiplier. You don't win wars with just guns, you win them with supply chains. Another critical factor is logistics. For every soldier, you have several more people employed supplying and maintaining that soldier's ability. A high-tech, cybernetically enhanced super soldier might be the equivalent of 100 normal troops, but if they need constant resupply of rare ammunition, expensive armor, and cutting-edge medical care, that may be unsustainable in a prolonged war. On the other hand, mass armies using standardized weapons and training are easier to replace and resupply, ensuring long-term operational effectiveness. This is one reason why nomads and hunter-gatherers often do well against civilized empires. They are day-to-day life, often converted to combat advantage in a way a traditional farmer might not, and they often already have their battle equipment as part of their daily life. The hybrid approach, balancing elites and massed forces. Historically, the most effective armies have used a hybrid approach, blending elite forces for high-stakes missions with large conventional armies for sustained conflicts. These elite troops often come from the ranks of seasoned veterans, ensuring both experience and adaptability. They often get rotated out of elite units to take leadership and training roles for newer units too. The Roman legions combined professional heavy infantry with auxiliary forces drawn from across the empire. Throughout history, from ancient to modern times, elite units, whether heavily armored cavalry or shadowy commandos, specialized in different missions. Some led charges on the battlefield, others infiltrated behind enemy lines to assassinate leaders or sabotage supply depots. Every role required different skills, equipment, and doctrine. An ace fighter pilot does not need to be a master marksman with a rifle or hand-to-hand combat expert. Spreading training too thin wastes resources that could be used to develop multiple specialists. But this is a modern perspective, and for context, the elite Jedi of Star Wars have an excuse for being amazingly good at lots of stuff. And in a real-world scenario, some transhuman with lots of physical and mental augmentation really could be a master at everything. But then we need to ask why they didn't spread that augmentation out to more people, or why, in comic book terms, Tony Stark has 100 different sets of armor only he pilots, or why Captain America's super soldier serum isn't mass-produced. The US military today uses special forces like Navy SEALs and Delta Force for high-stakes missions, but still relies on mass recruitment for large-scale conflicts. It's also not binary. You have a lot of levels of skill besides raw conscript and elite veteran. And skill is often specialized. Your shock troops probably do not know how to operate a tank or howitzer, and every hour spent training them to extra specialties like that is more initial training time and cost, or less focused on their own relevant skills. Skills must also be kept up, so you need regular maintenance training for any skill. You might train an elite unit, specifically be paratroopers who could drop near an artillery battery, seize the guns, and turn them on the enemy, or a Navy SEAL team to get control of a missile cruiser and fire on the enemy fleet, but that's adding a lot of additional training and specialized roles to a mission that has a lot of failure points, compared to just dropping in, killing the gun crews, and blowing up the guns. On the other hand, that's exactly where AI might come in handy, as it might be prepared in advance to be able to give the troops detailed instructions on something very technical and specific. Same as cameras and radios can let you patch into a specialist back at HQ who can tell you how to defuse that bomb by cutting that wire. While there is room for a wide spectrum of skills and resources in battle, indeed a wide variety of tools gives a commander a better hand than one-size-fits-all troops, you do need numbers. Warfare is a numbers game. Elite troops may turn the tide of battle, but only massive forces can win wars because they can hold large amounts of ground, do lots of missions simultaneously, and absorb casualties. Time, attrition, and logistics seem to necessitate lots of troops. Beyond clones, the future of mass-produced troops. Forget cloning, what if we could duplicate a battle-hardened veteran instantly? What if elite troops could be mass-produced without sacrificing their skills? What if entire battalions of seasoned veterans could be created overnight, already trained and battle-ready? This is where cloning, or more precisely, duplication, enters the discussion. In early sci-fi, written before we even understood DNA, the terms were often used interchangeably. However, cloning has since come to mean creating a genetically identical copy that starts as a blank slate, essentially a younger twin. Duplication, on the other hand, implies copying not just the body, but also the mind, creating an instant soldier with full training and experience. The description of what's going on with cloning and duplication process in Star Wars varies by author and timeline, but it gets dipped into well both during the Clone Wars novels and shows, as well as the Order Thrawn trilogy by Timothy Zahn that predates the prequels. In those prequels, we're told that they cloned one guy, Jango Fett, over and over again, and they did not have his memories, and had been tweaked for more obedient behavior. They had accelerated growth, maturing twice as fast as normal, and had excellent teachers and equipment. We get a good look at the reasoning for this in the novel Darth Plagueis, which for a lot of us Star Wars EU fans effectively ends the EU novels, or Legends, with Timothy Zahn's trilogy being the one that truly began them. This post-prequels version is very different from the other version under Grand Admiral Thrawn in that original Thrawn trilogy, where they could be grown in mere weeks and where they had flash-imprinted memories. So they came out of the tank as elite troops, which sounds a lot more useful. More importantly, Thrawn didn't clone one person over and over again. He had his commanders recommending the best performers during combat missions and was cloning those people. Why clone the same guy for running a tank, an AT-AT, a fighter, and being an infantryman? Why not clone your best fighter pilot and best infantrymen? And moreover, why not clone your best 10 at each job? And from your own ranks after a real-world combat assessment, given that your ability to comfortably work with an existing unit and structure and doctrine is pretty important, and not something a random mercenary would be likely to have. This method is clearly superior, as it avoids the pitfalls of predictability and overstandardization that come with copying a single individual repeatedly, while still producing elite and highly reliable soldiers in vast numbers. Needless to say, it only works if the necessary technology exists. By contrast, the method used for clone troopers seems far less effective. Ignoring the usual issues of scale in Star Wars, where galactic empires talk about having 1 million elite troops while forgetting that 1 million planets would render that number almost meaningless, cloning still doesn't seem like the best approach. I can accept that some people are genetically predisposed to be superior soldiers, and that raising 1 million of them in controlled, accelerated environments for a decade might yield better results than randomly selecting 10-year-olds and training them for 10 years. But is that really more effective than screening quadrillions of candidates across an empire of 1 million worlds, selecting the best 5 million 18-year-old volunteers and training them for just 2 years? They might not quite match the clones in skill, but with 5 times as many for the same training budget, the trade-off is hard to ignore. An even better approach would be to recruit a few billion soldiers from across the Empire, train them well, and then select the top 1% for an additional year or 2 of elite commando training. This would create a far larger force of highly trained troops while avoiding the limitations of cloning, making it a much more viable long-term strategy for maintaining military dominance. Incidentally, I mentioned volunteers. Growing people from scratch, raising them to be soldiers, and subjecting them to brutal combat training from childhood, essentially stealing their youth, is not only ethically horrifying, but may also be less effective than some might assume. I would wager it produces competent soldiers, but not necessarily ones superior to well-trained volunteers. Ironically, this practice wasn't exclusive to the oppressive Galactic Empire. It was done by the noble and ostensibly just Old Republic as well, albeit in its waning and corrupt final days. Of course, it was a Jedi program originally, so they might have different views on recruiting child soldiers. Regardless, this issue doesn't arise with adult volunteer recruitment, nor does it apply to duplicated soldiers. The Imperial Remnant openly engages in forced conscription, at least of adults, and while it's never explicitly stated that cloning candidates were volunteers, they are implied to be honored and loyal troops that are selected. More importantly, if an elite soldier volunteers to be copied 1,000 times, memories and all, then each duplicate would begin life with the same dedication. They wouldn't need additional training or indoctrination. Their loyalty and skills would be fully intact from the start. While they will inevitably diverge as they accumulate new experiences, their immediate willingness and capability to serve would be no different from the original. If you ask a duplicate whether they're still a volunteer, odds are they'll respond, "Yes, you asked me that yesterday. Oh, it's actually been months, and I'm the copy, aren't I?" At the moment, they are no different from the original, who has simply been sent on another mission, ready, willing, and just as capable. They are also no more expendable than anyone else, but they may regard themselves that way. A loyal soldier is typically willing to die for the cause, and certainly to risk their life, though their job is usually to make the enemy die for their cause instead. And they know there's 100 or 1,000 copies of them out there, they might be a lot more willing to make that sacrifice. Sci-Fi super soldiers, Dune, Warhammer 40k, and beyond. This brings us to the Death Corps of Krieg from Warhammer 40,000. These regiments are mass-produced, ultra-loyal, and completely expendable, modeled heavily on World War I trench warfare troops, complete with gas masks, bayonets, and an unwavering willingness to die in waves, assaulting enemy fortifications. Their creation involves a mix of eugenics, cloning, and accelerated vat-grown processes, though the exact details vary by source. Unlike Star Wars clone troopers, they are not identical clones with shared memories. Instead, they are raised from birth in a culture of total military indoctrination, where war is the only purpose of their life. Their entire civilization is driven by a deeply ingrained sense of atonement, believing they must redeem their world for a rebellion against the Imperium centuries ago. This has made Krieg a relentless war factory, supplying endless waves of disciplined, obedient soldiers to the Imperium's eternal wars. Warhammer 40k also plays with the idea of different recruitment philosophies. The Imperium deliberately maintains death wards, plants so harsh and inhospitable that only the strongest, most ruthless survivors can thrive. Some Space Marine chapters, such as the Blood Angels or White Skulls, recruit exclusively from these brutal environments, believing only those forged in constant struggle are worthy of super soldier enhancement. Others, such as the Ultramarines, recruit from their own highly civilized and well-governed wards, selecting the best and brightest not just for their combat potential, but for their leadership qualities, ensuring that their warriors can also rule and govern effectively. This theme of elite training versus harsh natural selection is also central to Dune. Unlike Warhammer 40k, where mass production of troops is common, Dune emphasizes individual mastery of combat and leadership. The Atreides soldiers from Caladan are considered the best of any great house, not because they are numerous, but because they are trained by exceptional leaders and raised in an environment of justice, discipline, and loyalty. This stands in contrast to the Harkonnens, who maintain far larger armies by brutally oppressing and exploiting their people. Despite their superior numbers and resources, they struggle to match the highly disciplined, professional soldiers of House Atreides, proving that quality can sometimes overcome quantity in the right circumstances. But Dune also introduces a different limiting factor: logistics and transportation. Open warfare is heavily restricted, and the Spacing Guild charges exorbitant fees to move troops across space, especially into actual conflicts. This means that in interstellar war, elite, high-impact forces are far more valuable than mass conscription armies because no one can afford to ship giant legions across the galaxy into a battle zone. Instead, military dominance comes from small but elite strike teams, highly trained assassins, and specialized forces like the Sardaukar, the Emperor's fearsome shock troops. Both Warhammer 40k and Dune show us different paths to military supremacy: industrialized mass production versus extreme elite training, each shaped by their respective worlds and the challenges of interstellar warfare. Both also love melee combat, and in Dune they justify this with personal shields. Guns just aren't useful in battle. Now, I said the Atreides soldiers in Dune are good, but they still lose to the Emperor Sardaukar, who in turn lose to the Fremen, and once Paul Atreides begins training the Fremen, they become even deadlier. The running theme here is that harsh worlds produce hardened warriors. It is fiction though, and I'd advise taking this notion with a grain of salt. Clearly, if your upbringing toughens you up and gives you relevant skills to your job, in this case soldiering, that upbringing advantages you, but I doubt it would to the degree implied in the series. Anyway, the secret of the Sardaukar's strength isn't that they're the best soldiers skimmed from the Empire's conscripts. Instead, the conscripts levied from the great houses are just support troops. The real Sardaukar are recruited from the Emperor's prison planet, Seleucia Secundus. This world is a bombed-out wasteland, a brutal, nearly uninhabitable hellhole where only the strongest and most ruthless survive. Prisoners are treated like expendable fodder, with many dying during training, but those who endure are rewarded lavishly and granted lives of privilege. They are indoctrinated to believe their suffering was a test, that only the strongest made it through, and that they are now elite warriors of the galaxy. This is an effective approach, one seen in many real-world elite forces. The first step in training an elite soldier is telling them that they are one. The belief in their own superiority and resilience makes them more willing to endure brutal training and more confident in battle. The psychological conditioning of being told they are the best, combined with real survival-based training, creates an incredibly deadly force. This mindset also matters in combat. When a soldier is wired to believe they are elite, failure doesn't seem like an option. The idea of retreating, abandoning comrades, or hesitating in the face of danger doesn't cross their mind the same way it might for an ordinary recruit. Well-justified arrogance can substitute or augment courage and bravery, which is especially useful when charging a fortified and entrenched position. It is easy to forget that one of the most dangerous jobs in siege warfare was being the first man up a scaling ladder to attack a wall, and that this role was often fiercely contested, not because these soldiers were suicidal, but because being the first up meant glory, recognition, and often a hefty cash reward. It is also worth remembering that before the invention of machine guns, standing on a fortress wall was not as safe as it might seem. People grew up shooting bows, crossbows, or guns, and an advancing army would fire at the defenders the whole way in. And crucially, they did not stop shooting just because their own troops were now at the wall, because unlike the joke about Stormtroopers missing their shots, real-world soldiers could indeed hit the broadside of a barn, or the top of a castle wall. The evolution of infantry weapons. When swords met muskets, armor lost. When muskets met machine guns, mass charges lost. The invention of heavy machine guns changed battlefield dynamics entirely. Unlike archers or riflemen who picked individual targets, machine gunners could sweep entire areas with thousands of rounds. Mounted guns with armor plates made it even harder to take them out, leading to the infamous trench warfare of World War I, where open charges became near-suicidal. Charges often weren't all that high speed either. It's kind of tricky to sprint through a mix of mud, razor wire, craters, and leftover debris. especially when getting sprayed with machine gun fire. To counter this problem, armies developed submachine guns and assault rifles. These weapons weren't about power or precision, they were built for suppressive fire, helping troops advance under enemy fire and clear trenches more effectively. Before that, standard rifles were too long and slow to fire to be very useful in a charge or inside a trench, where a bayonet or pistol was often the better option. Assault rifles themselves didn't appear until the end of World War II, but submachine guns and machine pistols were developed late in World War I and afterward. The Thompson submachine gun, Tommy gun, which became infamous during the Prohibition era as seen in many gangster films, as is the M3 Grease gun, which replaced it in World War II until it was phased out by weapons like the M1 carbine, the M14 rifle, and later the M16, which along with the AK-47 were the two primary assault rifles seen in warfare. These weapons were designed for storming fortified positions, usually while machine gun fire and artillery forced defenders to stay down rather than take well-aimed shots at the advancing troops. Assaulting soldiers could fire back, not with great accuracy, but enough to force the enemy to retreat while they pushed into the fortifications. Once inside, range and precision mattered far less. In tight corridors of trenches or bunkers, a firefight was more about rapid response than sharpshooting. A similar dynamic applies in modern urban combat for SWAT team-style house clearance drills. Ricochet wasn't a huge concern either. Most stray shots would still end up hitting the enemy in close quarters fighting, and mud and sandbags in a trench tend not to generate a lot of ricochet anyway. That's sort of their point: absorb shrapnel. We discussed breaching ship corridors in last month's Space Marines episode, and the same logic applies here. In a concrete bunker or steel-walled spaceship, short, maneuverable weapons work best for room clearing and hallway engagements. This explains the classic short-barreled carbine, submachine gun, or assault rifle look of Stormtroopers in Star Wars and many other franchises. A long rifle helps with range and accuracy, but it is unwieldy when moving quickly or fighting in confined spaces, hence why the M4 carbine is generally more popular than the longer-barreled M16, though the M16A4 remains my own personal favorite. Sci-Fi often assumes energy weapons like lasers, which theoretically wouldn't need long barrels for accuracy, at least at infantry ranges, but lasers are actually a poor choice for an assault weapon. The same energy used for a laser blast would be far more effective if used to propel a bullet. If a setting includes railguns or electromagnetic machine guns, then a longer barrel would still improve power and accuracy, just like with traditional firearms. This means futuristic infantry weapons could still resemble modern ones, compact for close quarters combat, but longer when precision or power is needed. Elite soldiers of the future may battle in orbit, across entire planets, or inside simulations. But how are they powered? What fuels those iconic suits of power armor, the weapons they wield, and the starships that carry them to the battlefield? In this month's Nebula exclusive episode, Antimatter Propulsion, we explore the most powerful energy source in the universe, how it might launch starships, arm entire fleets, and even fuel planetary invasions. Antimatter could become the backbone of future warfare, or the reason it ends before it begins. You can watch Antimatter Propulsion now on Nebula, the creator-owned streaming platform where all my episodes air early and ad-free. Nebula also features incredible content from creators like Real Engineering, Joe Scott, and Simon Clark. And don't miss The Sojourn, a Nebula original sci-fi audio drama where survival depends as much on trust as it does on technology. Set in a distant and dangerous star cluster, it's perfect for fans of space battles and the human stories behind them. Sign up at go.nebula.tv/IsaacArthur for a lifetime membership. Pay once and enjoy Nebula for as long as you and Nebula exist. You'll unlock hundreds of hours of early ad-free content, including dozens of SFA exclusives like Antimatter Propulsion and the sci-fi audio drama The Sojourn. Prefer a lighter commitment? You can also subscribe annually for just $36 a year. That's 40% off. And with guest passes, you can share Nebula with friends and family for a week of free access. No credit card needed, just great content. Now, let's return to the battlefield of the far future. AI, automation, and the future soldier. If the best shooter on the battlefield is an AI-assisted drone, where does that leave human soldiers? The answer might be safely at home with their families, though wars fought without life and death consequences have their own potential problems, something explored often in sci-fi, perhaps best known from Star Trek's episode a taste of Armageddon, and as we discussed in other episodes, you will probably need a person on the ground overseeing your robots. That person can probably still benefit from elite training and top-notch gear. AI and augmented reality could significantly change infantry combat dynamics, particularly when it comes to weapon accuracy and fire rate. Normally, a longer barrel offers diminishing returns, as modern firearms are already more accurate than a human can reliably utilize in most battlefield roles outside of sniping. However, advanced targeting system and AI-assisted aiming might justify longer barrels, especially if they could telescope or retract when needed for maneuverability. Superior materials might allow light or extendable barrels. At the same time, this could render traditional high rate of fire weapons redundant. Historically, military doctrine has shifted between accuracy-focused marksmanship and rapid-fire suppression tactics. Prior to World War I, training soldiers to shoot accurately was prioritized over high rates of fire. Ammunition was expensive and difficult to resupply, particularly before modern logistics and tracked vehicle ammo carriers. The shift towards spray-and-pray tactics became common from World War I through Vietnam, with automatic weapons and suppressive fire being emphasized. However, this approach was later reconsidered, as it proved less effective than anticipated, leading to a return to more controlled and accurate shooting doctrines. One of my favorite Army field manuals was FM 90-10, The Infantryman's Guide to Urban Combat, and you can see an interesting evolution in combat tactics through its various editions over the years. It is available online if you're curious. Other publications from the US Army and NATO forces show similar shifts, reflecting lessons learned from both urban and conventional warfare, and that will doubtless keep happening, as we're already seeing changes with the increasing use of drones acting as scouts, gun platforms, or even automated ammo resupply units. We could also see the development of guided grenade drones, capable not just of rolling into a building, but actively navigating winding corridors to seek out targets. We could even imagine bullets that can turn corners, or smaller rounds designed to act as personal point defense systems, intercepting incoming shots before they reach their target. But when it comes to traditional firearms, recoil remains a major limiting factor for accuracy. That's one advantage of laser rifles: they don't produce much recoil. It's not entirely absent, since photons have momentum, and firing a powerful laser still causes some kickback, albeit minor. However, with traditional firearms, there's a limit as to how powerful a shot you can fire before the recoil becomes too much for the shooter to handle. A weapon could, in theory, deploy a small stabilizing tripod when firing high-power shots, but that's not exactly practical for mobile infantry. Recoil is fairly predictable, meaning a computer could calculate and compensate for it to an extent, adjusting the aim slightly between shots. However, while a computer can adjust for how the gun moves, it cannot compensate for the way recoil shifts the shooter's entire body, which introduces more complexity. Automatically adjusting the barrel by fractions of a degree between shots is mechanically tricky, and while it might be possible, it is not necessarily practical for infantry. So in all likelihood, modern battlefield dynamics will persist for quite some time, with a combination of large volumes of inaccurate suppressive fire accompanied by low-frequency, well-aimed shots for precision. Drones might be awesome options for providing that suppressing fire, though I can never say suppressing fire anymore without picturing Cyril Figgis yelling it in the show Ultra. Anyway, troopers themselves might not be doing all that shooting. Instead, they could be accompanied by wheeled or tracked combat drones, armed with heavy machine guns and capable of deploying stabilizing legs for better accuracy when firing. Airborne drones would not fit this role as effectively, since the sheer volume of fire and recoil would likely knock them out of the air. However, they could be useful as mobile sniper platforms, providing long-range precision fire from above, and these are already seeing usage in modern conflicts. That said, while drones are already transforming modern warfare, we are also seeing the rapid development of anti-drone tactics and weapons in response. Fundamentally, an airborne drone, especially the common quadcopter variety, is highly vulnerable. It's slow, unarmored, and not particularly stealthy, making it easy prey for automated counter-drone turrets. Defensive systems capable of intercepting drones, incoming artillery shells, and even missiles will likely be standard on fortifications and armored vehicles in the future. And speaking of fortifications, Modern technology allows for extreme levels of battlefield defense, as we explored in our episode on Fortress Worlds. Assaulting a well-fortified position in the future will require elite troops with highly advanced gear and tactics. Simply throwing waves of cannon fodder at a modern fortress won't work, because any defense that can manufacture bullets cheaper than it can replace soldiers will always win. However, an enemy might shift tactics by attacking with thousands of small, cheap drones, forcing defenders to adapt yet again, leading to another shift in the endless arms race of warfare. Will humans ever be used in battle at all, or will robots take over? The answer likely depends on location and era, as we explored in Robots and Warfare, episode 403A, which is actually episode 537 in the new numbering system. And that brings up another question: what really counts as a soldier? Just as defining an episode gets murky, with bonus videos, live streams, and Sci-Fi Sundays inflating the real count to around 730 rather than 501, which is the number of Thursday episodes, future warfare blurs the line between human and machine. Going forward, our future episode numbering will reflect that reality, but the line between human and machine, or even what a soldier is, will likely only get more blurry. Future elite troops might not just be well trained but fully augmented. Cybernetic limbs, AI-assisted targeting, even genetic enhancements. We explore this in Super Soldiers, episode 381, Power Armor, episode 414, and Giant Robots and Power Armor, episode 182. But the key takeaway remains: any armor must be tough enough to absorb a hit, otherwise it's just for show, like the Stormtrooper armor in Star Wars. I honestly think its main function, beyond looking intimidating, which is a valid purpose in both sci-fi and real-world militaries, was to allow the filmmakers to recycle the same actors in a handful of suits over and over. Clones are good for that too. But that armor did not stop Han Solo's blast or pistol, making it essentially pointless. Modern body armor can absolutely stop pistol rounds and even mini rifle shots. Older armor, like flak jackets, was designed primarily to mitigate explosive shrapnel, which historically kills more soldiers than bullets. That's why artillery is known as the king of battle, plus the chess analogy that it moves slowly and is very vulnerable. If I haven't mentioned it this episode, while I spent most of my time while deployed in infantry roles, my original job in the military was artillery. This focus on stopping fragmentation rather than bullets is what shaped military armor design for much of history. Plate armor was incredibly effective in hand-to-hand combat, but it struggled against crossbows and longbows, which could penetrate it at range. When firearms appeared, armor shifted toward lighter protection, often just a thick breastplate rather than full suits of plate. Eventually, rifles rendered even that obsolete, leading to an era where most soldiers didn't wear significant armor at all, until Kevlar and other modern materials brought armor back into widespread use. To be fair, it was also expensive, but the insanely high rates of casualties we see in the 19th and early 20th century battlefields comes a lot from there being little use of body armor. Body armor is back, and it's likely to stay around for a long time because firearms haven't fundamentally changed much in over a century. Excluding magazine and belt-fed mechanisms, the last truly big advancement was the cartridge, replacing loose powder and ball ammunition. We have slightly better gunpowder, but chemistry limits further improvements. And while better metals and machine techniques have made barrels more durable, accurate, and resistant to overheating, those advances have also largely plateaued. That's why AK-47s and M2 Browning machine guns, the former designed in 1947 and the latter in 1933, are still in use today. Neither is the pinnacle of modern weaponry, but they remain highly effective and cheap to make. Plus, there are millions of them lying around. This stagnation in firearms technology means that if we develop slightly better materials than Kevlar, such as graphene superlaminate, or if powered exoskeletons allow for additional armor, then modern firearms could become essentially useless against infantry. However, that doesn't mean bigger guns will simply render armor obsolete again. Armor-piercing rounds, needle guns, or lasers might burn through thick armor, but they may also leave relatively small wounds that aren't immediately incapacitating. Future armor could incorporate self-sealing gels or regenerative materials to mitigate damage, keeping soldiers in the fight longer. This concept is explored in the Battletech novels, particularly those by Michael Stackpole, where one faction employs 8-foot-tall, selectively bred super soldiers clad in advanced battle armor. Stackpole, along with Timothy Zahn, also wrote some of the more realistic and engaging Star Wars novels, adding a grounded sense of military tactics and logistics to their sci-fi settings. Power armor allows soldiers to carry heavier armor and more powerful weapons. These two factors wouldn't simply cancel each other out. If modern armor evolves to become impenetrable to conventional firearms, then those same materials would likely make exoskeleton-enhanced armor reasonably effective against exoskeleton-mounted weapons as well. This could even bring melee weapons back into play, as power-assisted swords, hammers, and axes could deliver devastating blows capable of breaching armored opponents. Needless to say, having cyborg arms and legs can also let you carry more weapons and armor and help mitigate the recoil. However, I suspect more subtle changes like targeting and improved vision and reflexes would be even more useful, as would AI-controlled medical packs or restorative nanobots. If history is any guide, no matter how advanced weapons become, war will always be shaped by the balance of technology, strategy, and the human, or post-human, soldier wielding them. Cybernetic warriors, the post-human soldier. At what point does a cybernetic warrior stop being a soldier and start being a machine? Cybernetic augmentation offers enormous advantages on the battlefield. Neural implants could shave milliseconds off reaction times, allowing soldiers to process threats and make tactical decisions faster than an unaugmented human ever could. Enhanced muscle fibers and skeletal reinforcements could allow for the effortless use of heavy weapons and armor, making a single soldier as resilient as an entire squad. Augmented vision, AI-assisted targeting, and direct neural interfaces with drones and support systems could turn every soldier into a highly mobile networked battlefield commander, responding to threats with machine-like precision while retaining human adaptability and creativity. But at what point do these enhanced soldiers cease to be human in any meaningful way? At what point does the distinction between an elite warrior and an autonomous war machine become meaningless? It is an old question, one that has haunted science fiction and military planners alike, and as technology advances, the line between man and machine is only going to blur further. In the end, whether wars are fought by superbly trained stormtroopers, enhanced soldiers, cybernetic warriors, or vast automated armies, the fundamental truth remains. Victory in war belongs to the side that adapts the fastest, fights the smartest, and wields the most advanced tools with the greatest skill. Just the stormtroopers of Star Wars represent the cutting edge of a galaxy-spanning empire. Future soldiers, whether flesh and blood or machine, will define the next era of warfare. Thanks for joining me for this 501st episode of Science and Futurism with Isaac Arthur. If you enjoyed this discussion of futuristic warfare, make sure to like, subscribe, and check out our previous episodes on Space Marines, Super Soldiers, Power Armor, and more. Until next time, thanks for watching, and have a great week.